Dear viewers, welcome to a brand new episode of Africafé. Today's topic is climate finance in Africa. We will explore the current state of affairs, challenges, and also the ways forward for building climate resilience and sustainability in the continent. However, before we dive in, let's have a quick overview.
Securing climate finance is vital to empower Africa in addressing the escalating impacts of climate change. In 2020, UN data revealed that 9 out of 10 countries most affected by climate change were in Africa. From 2011 to 2020, approximately 16.5 million people on average have been impacted by droughts and floods annually across the continent. Africa's share of the global population is expected to increase from 17% to 14% by 2100, reaching nearly 11 billion by the end of the century. Climate finance is thus essential for ensuring that Africa's development aligns with the imperative of limiting global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius and building a more sustainable future.
Sabrina Imran, you're an economist at the Policy Center for the New South. Your expertise is energy and commodities, so thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Hamza. It's really a pleasure.
So just to start off, can you just give us the significance of implementing initiatives in Africa aimed at financing climate change mitigation and also facilitating the transition to clean energy sources?
So I think this is a key issue for several reasons, but I'm going to mention the ones that strike as the most significant for me. I think that one, there is a lot of inequality that is embedded within the issue of climate change in Africa. So it is a continent that emits only 3% of the global greenhouse gas emissions in the whole world, but suffers the most unfair and the most terrible impacts and repercussions of climate change. Not only that, but it is also a vital issue. And when I say vital, I really mean it, because according to the World Health Organization, we could have additional 250,000 deaths happening between 2030 and 2050 due to climate change. And there is also economic losses and financial losses due to the health issues related to climate change that could range between 2 and 4 billion annually by 2030. And I'm not saying that there is nothing that is happening. A lot is happening. It's coming first from the will and the volunteer from the African countries to actually change the status quo and to accompany energy transition, to leverage clean energy sources, but also external parties to take part in this challenge for African countries. And I believe that the COP27 is a good example of this, the one that happened in Sharm el-Sheikh, because it put the African continent at the heart of the discussions. However, I still think that today we are a bit behind. We are really behind, and we lack the necessary financing in order to unlock this problem for the African continent.
I mean, you've mentioned some key data, and can you just give us other specific data regarding the current state of financing in the continent? Because you've mentioned that the share is relatively low.
Yes.
But you know, what are the exact figures, and how can we quantify the deficit that needs to be addressed?
I think that one of the striking examples would be the report issued by the African Development Bank in 2020. This actually stated that we need $213.4 billion in order to finance the climate action or fill in the climate investment gap in Africa by 2030. And basically, if you need this, you need it from the private sector, because the public sector contribution remains relatively low in African countries. And if you want to see the real numbers in 2020, it was actually $4.2 billion coming from the private sector, which is really low, and which means that the path is still very long to take. And one of the other striking examples, in my opinion, is that for each dollar coming from the public sector, we actually need $9 from the private sector in order to fill in the climate investment gap in general. However, in low and middle income countries, among which a lot are in the African continent, $1 of public investment was only met by 25 cents from the private sector, which is really shocking. This is why we need to leverage more effort in this area, in my opinion.
So, I mean, this statistics, they kind of share a mixed message, that there's progress, there's challenges in Africa's climate commitment. So can you just highlight the initiatives that are actively and currently addressing climate change in Africa?
Yes, as you mentioned, that there are mixed messages, and thankfully there are initiatives that are taking place. There are several, but I will only focus on a few ones that I think that are the most important ones in my opinion. So the Paris Summit, for instance, is one of the key initiatives of the last decade because it actually urges African countries to lower their greenhouse gas emissions and to also make more effort when it comes to energy transition. However, one of the problems is actually the last element because it requires African countries to do more, and it's sometimes beyond their means. It actually requires them to do more in terms of adaptation and mitigation, which actually takes me to the second initiative, which is the Loss and Damages Fund. And basically the Loss and Damages Fund is made for every impact of climate change that is catastrophic and could not have been avoided or mitigated thanks to adaptation and mitigation. And it actually requires from developing countries and international institutions to actually make more effort in helping developing countries from the repercussions of climate change. Another initiative would be the recent Paris Summit for a new financial architecture. And it is important because it actually gives us results already. So we have the $100 billion coming from the IMF in 2021 in special drawing rights. We also have the new tool kit introduced by the World Bank in order to help debt relief in developing countries and in order to be an emergency fund as well. And finally, we also have the restructuring of Zambia's debt, which is a huge step which would help the debt relief of the country, but also hopefully accompany the country in its energy transition efforts.
So these are good initiatives, obviously. They try to meet the challenges, but there's also the obstacles. Can you also give us some ideas on the obstacles hindering climate financing in Africa?
Yeah, so there are a lot of obstacles, and I mean, I'd like also to focus on the obstacles coming from the financement that we lack from the private sector. And I think this comes often from a mismatch between what private investors have as expectations of the business climate, of how they would do projects in developing countries, and the reality of things. And this is a double burden because when you don't have the right background for receiving investment, you don't receive them, and you stay stuck in a loop actually of lacking financing and advancing in sustainable infrastructure projects, for instance.
So there's a disconnect clearly here between the private sector and the actual conditions faced by the recipient countries. Can you also pinpoint the reasons, like the specific reasons?
Yes, so there are several reasons. I think one that strikes me the most also is the ratings provided by private agencies, because as a foreign private investor, this is the mirror through which you judge the country in which you're going to direct your investments. And often these ratings are penalizing for developing countries because, one, they also have the necessary infrastructure. So I think that the problem should go beyond only financing the project itself or sustainable projects only, but also helping these countries have the right background to receive additional financing in the future as well. You have to think of it as a sustainable approach overall. So
you have domestic resource mobilization, you have also the need for flexible and innovative financing. So these are both key elements. So we should conclude at the moment, but can you just give us the key solutions and strategies that can be adopted to enhance the overall climate financing in Africa?
So I always love to conclude with a positive note. I think that one, like you mentioned it, we need additional flexibility, but also when we take into account the risk appetite of foreign investors, we should take into account that we should help them mitigate these risks. And I think that having like the right financial instruments and the right financial framework could be helpful. This could be done, for instance, by actually suggesting hedging instruments that would help mitigating the risks, using like innovative financial solutions like working with financial markets in order to make it more appealing for foreign investors. Two, I think it's actually to enhance transparency basically in developing countries and make it a business-friendly place for receiving investment from institutions and from private investors. And finally, I think that there is a high component of reducing the greenwashing risk in the financing industry, because it would actually leverage trust between both parties and would benefit the development of green infrastructure projects in developing countries.
Sabrine, thank you for sharing your insights on this topic and being with us.
Thank you very much for having me, Hamza.
And dear viewers, thank you for checking in. And if you want more information on the topics, please find the link for a policy brief in the description below.